We all rely on farmers and ranchers, but farming is riskier than other businesses out there. Crop insurance helps farmers manage their risk. With crop insurance, farmers put skin in the game by paying premiums and shouldering deductibles. That keeps taxpayers from having to pick up the whole bill every time disaster strikes. Today, about 90% of U.S. farmland is insured, providing $100 billion in protection to more than 130 different kinds of crops. It's a testament to the program's success.
Thanks for joining us on Agri-Pulse.com. We're joined today by Bill O'Connor with Watkinson Miller. Bill, appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
For starters, I was hoping you could walk us through kind of the timeline of your career as far back as you'd like to go, all the way up until the present.
Well, I came to Washington in 1979 and went to work in the Republican leadership offices. And in 1980, the election in 1982 did not go well for Republicans after having a good year in 1980. And they lost several seats. And among them were the top 3 Republicans on the Agriculture Committee. The guy I was working for in the leadership was Ed Madigan from Illinois. And he had taken a leave from the Agriculture Committee in order to be in the leadership. And they came and begged him to come back to the Agriculture Committee, to be the ranking member, because they had knocked out all the guys ahead of him. And he, except for one, and that was Jim Jeffords. And there were people from the center part of the country who were very nervous at the thought of Jim Jeffords being the Republican voice for agriculture. So they begged Madigan to come back, and against his better judgment, he did, and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and dragged me back with him. And that's how I became an Aggie. And then I worked for him on the Agriculture Committee from early 1983, until he went to the Agriculture Department. Once again, I was drugged by the scruff of my neck down to the Agriculture Department. And that didn't work out well for Mr. Bush. So we were only there for about 18 or 19 months. I came back to the Hill, worked for Pat Roberts, back on the Agriculture Committee, and stayed on the Agriculture Committee until I left the Hill in 2008 or 9, where I came here to work for what is now Watkinson Miller, and that's what I've done in this town.
Mm-hmm. So I heard from a former colleague of yours that Pat Roberts, when he was trying to convince you to come back to the Hill, described you as the best pothole spotter that he knew.
Yeah, Pat Roberts is a member, has meetings of his staff that work on issues, and because he's Mr. Agriculture in Kansas and a lot of the nation, he has a lot of people working on agriculture. And we'd sit around his office and talk about issues and ideas, and people would bring up ideas, things that they thought would be a good idea, and I frequently was there to throw grenades at it to see if they went off and caused it to die. And that may have been what he was referring to about being a pothole spotter.
Yeah, some interesting ideas brought up, or some crazy ideas brought up.
There were, and as I was there longer, I realized that none of them were new. There are no new ideas in agriculture. They're just redressed up in new clothes and put a fresh coat of paint on them and run them out. And if you've been around long enough, which a lot of people aren't anymore around long enough, but if you've been around long enough, you go, that didn't work the last 3 times. There's no reason to think it's going to work this time. And toward the end particularly, when I'd been there quite a while, that was what a lot of what I did was say, it sounds real good, but it doesn't work very well. And then, of course, after that was all through and you had all those conversations, then you had to figure out what to do. So then we'd all get together and figure out what would work and what we could do.
Mm-hmm. So did the encyclopedic knowledge of farm policy, did that prove to be an attribute or a detriment at certain times then?
Well, it depended on who you were working with. If you were working with a member, because we were helping all the members of the committee, all the Republican members of the committee, not just Mr. Roberts or Mr. Smith or whichever chairman it was at that time. If you were trying to help them, they could get very impatient and it's understandable that they would, when they would bring their great idea that their constituent had brought to them and they thought through and thought it was a really good idea, and you would explain to them why it wouldn't work. And then you would further explain to them why the chairman was not going to support it, because the chairman didn't like to do that. He'd delegate that task out to someone, and you could get yourself in a fair amount of hot water with some individual members that way. Some were more understanding than others.
And it's often said and often thought that really the views that people have on policy are often shaped by their upbringing and how they came to Washington really before they even set foot in town. For you, how did your upbringing prior to arriving in Washington shape your views?
Well, I'm a conservative Republican and always have been. So that's one of my views. My views on agriculture are very freeform because, well, I was born on a farm, not born on a farm, but born to a farm, a small farm in northern Oklahoma. That was, my father quickly realized that he wasn't a farmer, and even if he was, there's no money in farming. So we left that when I was about 4 years old. And so I didn't really, well, I grew up in Kansas. My big thing about agriculture was that I saw wheat in the distance from the highway. And I was not steeped in farming. I did not have an agricultural degree from college. So a lot of the prejudices people bring from their farm, I didn't have. And it allowed me to look at things objectively. I remember when the farmers rally with tractors, the tractorcade came to town. Some of the guys that were in the tractorcade were very aggressive guys. I shouldn't say it's a tractorcade. It was sort of like several years after that, the sort of sons of tractorcade came to town. And they were very aggressive, and they were very unhappy and very upset with the way things were. And they had found out that I didn't have a farm background. And they sort of trapped me out in the hall and really got up in my face and said that I didn't know anything about farming. I had no business doing this, and I ought to get out of it because what did I know anyway? And I said, look, guys, I don't know anything about farming. You're right. I can't grow wheat, and I don't know how to raise cows. But you don't know anything about agricultural policy either. You don't know how to pass a law, and you don't know what it takes. So why don't we sit down and work on this together? They stayed mad. It didn't work, but it was a hell of a good argument. So I used it a few times after that.
So on that front, how have you seen since the beginning of your career up until now? I'm trying to do the mental math in my head. Is that 6 farm bills?
5 farm bills that I did. I came in just after one, and I left before they implemented the last one. So
okay.
5 farm bills I worked on.
Okay. So how did you see the process? The old schoolhouse rock, how a bill becomes law. How did that change between day one of your career and up until the final time you walked off the Hill?
Probably the first thing that changed was the administration was squeezed out of the process. Didn't matter which administration. The presidency was squeezed out of the process. It hadn't been a huge player even the first time I did it, but there were a couple of times they didn't even submit a farm bill. They didn't even bother. Sort of like, this has become a congressional process. You guys do it. And we overrode presidential vetoes. You didn't do that on big pieces of legislation with a lot of money involved. But you did in agriculture because that's the way it was. So that was one change. And the second change was when I first got there, when you looked at the Agriculture Committee in the House, the top half of the committee was full of farmers, guys who actually had farms, and full of guys that had been there 25 years or more. When I left, there were almost no farmers, and there were 2 guys that had been there for 20 years. The Agriculture Committee had become a way station for people's rural members' careers, and which is why I knew so many members, so many senators, because they used to be on the House Agriculture Committee. And they left the House Agriculture Committee, went to Appropriations, they went to Ways and Means, and then they ran for the Senate. And at one time, there were like 9 senators that had been on the House Agriculture Committee and weren't necessarily really connected to agriculture at all anymore. They had just that's where they started, and then it went away. The other thing is that the Democrats just don't have any agriculture anymore. When you take a look at They won enough seats this time. They actually got a few rural members back. But like Sherry Bustos is like a big deal because she's actually got rural members, and she won a rural district. Many of the people who go on the Agriculture Committee from the Democratic side of the aisle are drafted on because they have to make up the numbers. And they're given third committee assignments in order to take the ag assignment. So you have suddenly a lot more interest by those kinds of members in nutrition programs and a lot less interest in commercial agriculture, a lot of interest in what many people would have seen as peripheral issues in agriculture when I was in the middle part of my time on the Hill. Organic and fruits and vegetables and things like that. That's now a much bigger deal, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle. And that has changed how things are considered. It's changed how the negotiations inside the committee on a farm bill take place. And to some degree has changed the outcome of the farm bill.
Are we making farm policy a more partisan process? Because we always talk about how it's not partisan, it's regional. But if we're only electing Republicans...
Everything is more partisan. And it's not just because they're electing only Republicans. It's because when I first came to the Hill, and I'm starting to sound like I'm 1,000 years old, and I am actually 1,000 years old. When I first came to the Hill, the Armed Services Committee was very bipartisan. They didn't even have an intelligence committee. They had a select committee on intelligence. That was very bipartisan. Agriculture was very bipartisan. The partisan committees were judiciary and things like that, Ways and Means, and Energy and Commerce. Now those bipartisan committees are becoming more partisan because everything is more partisan. It's a much more partisan place. When I first got there, the Democrats had been in control of the House since 1954, I think it was, 1954. And everybody thought they were going to be in control of the House until the earth cooled because they just got used to it. And what that did is tended to make things more bipartisan. Because if you're a Republican and you're going to get anything done, you need to work with the Democrats. And the Democrats, because at that time they had two kinds of Democrats. They had more conservative Democrats and more liberal Democrats. And we had more conservative Republicans and more liberal Republicans. Coalitions inside the two parties would form to pass legislation that was more liberal, that would draw from both parties, or more conservative, that would draw from both parties. That's completely changed. The conservatives have all moved toward the Republican Party. Liberals have all moved toward the Democratic Party. The result is they have nothing to say to each other anymore. And you don't have coalition building between parties. Is very difficult to do now. Very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. As you look back at your career in your time in Washington, is there any one particular legislative accomplishment that you really hang your hat on?
Surviving. No, not really. I mean, basically, I did a lot of things. The other thing that changed, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is we used to do legislation, a lot of different bills. Now you just do the Farm Bill. That's it. I mean, basically, they just finished their legislative effort in the Agriculture Committee for the next 5 years, unless they change. Before, we did credit bills, we did different kinds of legislation, plus we had pesticide legislation, which nobody wants to touch because it's too ugly. And we used to do a lot of CFTC work, which they're talking about doing again. And so we had sort of, every year you had some chunk of legislation to do. They really don't do that anymore. And I think that's kind of sad because I think it's one of the reasons that people are not as excited as members about being on the Agriculture Committee unless you happen to be in a Farm Bill year. You're not going to do anything. But that's the way it's worked out. The Farm Bill just keeps getting bigger and bigger, more titles, more like all the crop insurance is now in the Farm Bill. It's not a separate piece of legislation. We don't do food stamp legislation anymore. It's all in the Farm Bill. And that's another big change that took place while I was there.
Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, does that improve the process and the legislative product, putting it all within the Farm Bill?
No,
you don't think so?
I don't think so, no. You end up, for example, if you're trying to work on crop insurance, which is an incredibly complex and important system, you end up trading pieces of it off for something in the wheat title or the wheat program. That's probably not good for crop insurance. Same thing's true about anything you put in there about pesticides. It becomes peripheral to the programs. And the programs are still treated by members who have a lot of rural constituency as a really big deal, even though they have shrunk in size and impact on farmers, on individual farmers. They're still treated as a big deal, and you can trade off a lot of stuff for them. And that frequently causes trade-offs that are not necessarily a good idea, and also it causes you not to spend a lot of time focusing on things like all of credit is in the Farm Bill now. Well, making sure farmers have credit and the different ways that's done is probably something that deserves a good long look, and it doesn't get as much as I think it needs to get in a mashed together Farm Bill with 14 titles.
So when you're not on the clock, either here or throughout your time on Capitol Hill, when you're off, nights, weekends, what have you, what's what kind of activities do you use to fill your time?
Mostly catch up on chores, and I love to read. I've been a reader since I was a kid, and I crank through history and fiction, and so I do a lot of reading. My wife drags me out to do things from time to time, and then I enjoy it when she does, but that's not what I think of. What I first think of is get a good book and sit down and read it.
Any one particular literary subject that you mentioned?
Military history is probably the strongest. That's the interesting thing. When I came to town, I wanted to do defense work, and I had trained in college as a military historian, and so I ended up in Aggie, which is probably the best short description of what it's like on Capitol Hill. You don't end up doing what you were going to do. You end up doing what your boss wants you to do.
In talking with some folks, I've heard you described as either a teddy bear or somebody phrase it as a grizzly bear with a great disposition. Where do you think in that spectrum you fall?
I'd like to believe that pretty easy to get along with. When I was the staff head of the committee, I could sometimes get really impatient with people because I didn't like to listen to them invent what they were talking about. I prefer that they just tell me what's going on, straight story. And so I got impatient with people from time to time, and I would get impatient with people when they wanted unrealistic things and kept pressing for it when it had been explained to them why it was unrealistic. But other than that, I tried to keep the door open, talk to everybody, and tried to be pleasant, but you'd have to ask them whether I made it or not.
I'll wrap up this interview with the same way we wrap up all of the others. If you could travel back in time and speak to the version of Bill O'Connor walking to work on his first day on the job on Capitol Hill, what would be your one piece of advice that you would most want to impart?
Duck when Madigan grabs for you.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. Basically, it would depend on which job you were talking about. But the first day that I went to work in the Agriculture Committee, I'd probably say, go ahead and get your head around this and enjoy it, because it's going to be fun, even though you're wondering why you're here. And I did for a while. It's sort of like, what in the world am I doing this? But it turned out to be fun. It's interesting, and turns out that legislating is legislating, and it really doesn't matter what you're legislating on. And the guys in the Agriculture Committee were pretty easy to get along with. And when I started, and still to a large degree, it's not a terribly partisan, nasty place. And when I started, it wasn't partisan very much at all. So you could sit down and work through things and not just shout and figure out how to get more votes than the other guy and beat his head in, which unfortunately is what it's like now in a lot of parts of Capitol Hill. I think not quite that bad in agriculture, and hopefully it won't ever get that bad.
Bill, appreciate you joining us.
You betcha.